there's a separation between mosque and state, and that's typically associated with the Sunni tradition, Sunni Islam. That is until the 20th century, and now you see the rise of Islamic fundamentalism, which is changing the landscape of it. But until the 20th century, Sunni Islam was the big advocate for the separation of these two things, although even Sunni Islam recognizes what we might call not a geopolitical, or it's not a theocracy that it advocates, but it advocates the theonomy of the law. In other words, it supported the foundation of societal law in the Quran, even though it maintained that the governing body and the religious body should be kept relatively separate. Does that make sense? So the law is the overarching grounding of Islamic society in Sunni Islam, whereas the government was recognized as being in some sense separate. And of course, this is modern Turkey today, this is the way in which modern Turkey has adopted Western ideas about separation of church and state, created a secular society which stands in some distinction from the Islamic religious tradition, although not totally, as is the case with our system of government. Shia Islam typically tends to be theocratic. It views the unity of the political order and the unity of the religious order together. So not only is it theonomous, not only does it believe that God gives the laws to society, it believes that, generally speaking, society is going to be governed by representatives of the religious tradition, or at least people who are subordinate to the religious tradition. And in that sense, it's kind of a reversal of the Constantinian model of Christianity, and the Constantinian model, the Eastern model, is that the emperor appoints the patriarch, to put it another way, the patriarch, he functions kind of like a local pope or a national pope. The emperor appoints the pope, whereas in the West, Western Christianity has maintained since the medieval period the separation of church and state. So you don't have an exact duplication of the Christian understanding that there is such a thing between the secular powers and the religious powers. In this, you have something which closely approximates it when you see a separation between mosque and the state, but you have to recognize that their law is not based on something like the notion of human nature or natural law. It's based on the idea that God's law should govern. And there are actually Christians who advocate a kind of return to this view. There's something called Christian Reconstruction. So there is a version of Christianity out there that would be happy with an analogous system in the United States. So it's not entirely different from Christianity, but it's quite different from Christianity with respect to the issue that all exists. In talking about the term Islam, I think we'll start there. That's probably the best. The word itself, Islam, comes from an Arabic term, al-Islam. And that comes from an Arabic root, the SLM root, if we transliterate it. And it comes, according to two different etymologies, either from filling in that root with the word al-sama, right, which means to accept, submit, surrender, or subordinate oneself, or it comes from salema, which means submission, but submission as resulting in what we would call peace or purity or obedience. Okay? So there are two possible roots. There are lots of etymological arguments within the Islamic tradition as to exactly where the name for the tradition itself comes from. But the important thing is that there are two different themes that this strikes. Right? One theme is that religion is a religion of servitude, or we could even use the more radical word slavery to something. And by the way, this is not unique to Islam. Christianity, in the person of St. Paul, calls himself a doulos, or a slave to Christ. So this idea is how do we say, an ancient Mideastern idea, but it means radical submission to the God, right? That's one possible way of translating, radical submission to the God. The other possible alternative is to see it as the peace of Allah, or a religion which is based in peace. But even when you define it that way, there's a certain ambiguity in the term peace, because it's peace of a particular kind. It's the peace of subordination to a more powerful individual. And of course, in this case, it's God, right? So that the Muslim is subordinate to God, and by virtue of that subordination to God, the Muslim achieves peace. Does this make sense? All right, so on one hand, you've got the possibility of describing it as submission to Allah. On the other hand, you've got the possibility of describing it as peace to Allah, but peace achieved by submission to God. And by the way, this is not, in the term itself, there's nothing radical here by itself. I mean, this is the way monotheistic traditions typically understand the relationship between the individual and the God represented in the tradition. The word Allah is itself an interesting word because it's formed apparently from the definite article al and the word ilah. And here it's best translated probably, and whenever you see the word Allah, it's best translated using what Bertrand Russell would call the reverse iota operator. It means the one and only, the distinctively different, right? So that there is no other rival to it. So if I say you're absolutely unique, if I get to know you as a student, I say you're really unique, well that could be an insult, that could be a compliment. But if I'm meaning it in an objective way, I'm really just saying there's no one like you, right? I've never met anybody like you. And in the case of Allah's own name, is built in the idea that this is the one and only, the unique God. There is no other God. And that raises interesting theological issues because very often Muslims and Jews and Christians get into arguments about whether Allah is the same as the Christian God or whether Allah is the same as the Judaic God. So, well, I'm not going to resolve those problems for you, but the claim is a strong one on the part of Islam that they know who God is and they know Him with great precision. This is not all that different from the way in which God is named in the Old Testament as I am who am. So it's not what we would call the personal name of God in Islam. That's not something that Muslims are typically viewed as being privy to. And they do have the 99, those beautiful names, magnificent names of God as well. They name God using other predicates. But nevertheless, this is the way in which God refers to us most often. And it suggests something that I think all three traditions are really maintaining at the same time, namely that they maintain that there is a single God and that they know something about His unique character. We're going to say a little bit more later about how Muslims actually view their own understanding of the predicates of God because they don't view them typically the way Christians and Jews do. We already said that Christians and Jews, when they think about God, they think about some properties which are abstractable, which we would say are somehow in the world but also in God. Muslims tend to be very careful about this. They don't want to compound the perfections of God by suggesting that they are actually in the world in a real sense. And so some scholars have said this tends to be God nominalism, which is to say that we can make analogies between God, but the analogies are not founded in any commonly shared predicates. Put it another way, He's very transcendent. This God is exceptionally transcendent. The problem with the name, well, there's no problem with the name Islam, but the problem with Westerners when they approach this religious issue is that they named it in ways which are fundamentally offensive to Muslims. Well, this may be true of any name that we've talked about within this class pretty much, because there are always names for religious traditions which are acceptable. But one of the big mistakes, particularly even among very good scholars of Islam in the 19th or 20th century, is to call Islam Mohammedanism, or the Mohammedan faith. What's problematic about this? And you can see there that I say it's a blasphemous innovation. But why is it a blasphemous innovation? Why would no Muslim want to be called a Mohammedan faith?
Well, first off, when we look at Islam, we see a negative connotation to it. And then to have it focus on Muhammad, yes, he was the prophet, but it's not solely about Muhammad, it's about Allah.
Yeah, exactly right. It's displacing the important being in the scheme of things, right? It's putting a human being in the place of God. And the Muslim has no doubt that it's God who has delivered this message. It is not, as it were, filtered through Muhammad's categories of experience. In fact, it's literally dictated to Muhammad. So there's a tendency to push back on any attempt to displace God in an idolatrous way, which this would be, in some sense, right? To suggest that Muhammad has a role, for example, like Jesus. Because again, First of all, that's doubly bad from the Islamic point of view because Jesus is not God, right? He's a prophet. And then secondly, Muhammad does not have the status of a supreme being. So it's better to refocus attention on where the message comes from. And the message comes from be God, right? From Allah. We know that it originated on the Arabian Peninsula in the 7th century. At least the 7th century is when it became truly active. Of course, Muhammad was born a little bit earlier in the 7th century. And then Islam spread very rapidly throughout the world, particularly the Mediterranean region, and then into Europe. So that by the coming of the first millennium, it's actually in most of the countries surrounding the Mediterranean Sea. So it expanded very, very dramatically. And this is because its own missionary zeal was coupled also with no reticence to actually unite people and then to move and take over other countries, so that it is also an expansionist religion, at least in its early forms. It's not any longer today. It's hardly united the way it was at one time, but it spreads very quickly. And then, of course, roughly in the medieval period, the full extent of Islam begins to shrink again until finally it moves back into territories that are, well, I guess, half of the Mediterranean as opposed to all the Mediterranean. In terms of its geographical location, this gives us some insight into the Islamic worldview. Let's sort of skip over that. Now talk about the Islamic worldview. When we talk about the Islamic worldview, what we're really talking about are the conditions, first of all, culturally that gave rise to it. And then we're going to say some things about the language, although we don't have a lot of time to talk about the language the way that we have in the past. But what I want to say is should be sufficient to give you some picture of exactly the kind of culture that the text, the Quran, is emerging from. And one of the best ways to do that is to just take a look at a map of the Arabian Peninsula, which is where Islam emerged from, right? Muhammad was an Arabian trader, a family of Arabian traders, a particular family. And what you notice is that this peninsula is surrounded, and of course the extent of it would have been a little different in antiquity, but it's surrounded on 3 sides by water, and then by the Syrian desert in the north and the east. In the northeast, there's the Syrian desert. So effectively, this was a territory, because of its arid geography, it consists mainly of volcanic steppes and deserts, right? With some regions are well watered, but they tend to be coastal, and then there tend to be oases that punctuate this kind of arid wasteland at points. It tends to be a place that's fairly uninhabitable. In fact, the interior of the peninsula was not much inhabited by people in towns until trading routes became very vigorous. Now, there's some debate among archaeologists whether there weren't trading routes in early antiquity, the Neva event. But as far as we know, real settlements, interior settlements, like those of Medina, and Mecca, were only established around 400 years in the Common Era. So that it really took lots of traffic moving across the desert for these towns to be established. An analogy would be to some of the towns in the Australian outback. If you've got trade, right, or if you've got a product to produce there, then people will beat a path to your door, so you can be supplied. But in arid regions where there's really not enough water to support thousands of people, what has to happen? You have to dig deep wells, or you have to bring in, and you have to bring in lots of material goods. And this wasn't possible until the trade routes were established. So that Muhammad himself grows up in a culture which has already established a foothold in the interior of the country on the basis of trade. And it's trade that enables the cities to grow up there. What else to say about it? Oh yeah, the surroundedness of the peninsula itself suggests the name that the inhabitants of the Arabian Peninsula give to themselves. That's Al Jazeera, meaning the island. And it is an island. And it's an island which was relatively separate from the rest of the civilizations at the time. One which was characterized by a particular form of life which was essentially nomadic, so that in its origins, the culture that Muhammad inherited was very similar to the nomadic life, probably 1,500 years before the Common Era in Israel as well. So these were nomadic people. They were linked together by bloodlines. They tended to be what we would say called polygynous, which is to say that they practiced a form of one man, multiple wives, and the typical societal structure was pyramidal. The sheikh or the local ruler, the local patriarch was on top, and then underneath them consisted of his blood kin, and those would be immediate blood kin, and then more distant blood kin, cousins, nephews, and so on. And then below that, there would be client people that attached themselves to the sheikhs, the client people being the individuals who helped them in their trading operations. So it was essentially pyramidal and tribal. And pyramidal and tribal meant, of course, that what happens to all people who are engaged, first of all, in trying to water their flocks in a territory which has limited water, and then later on, competitor traders, it meant that there was very often war between the tribes would break out, which was internecine, mutually bloody, and which was based on vendetta. So in other words, if someone did something to you, you had to, in order to restore your honor, you had to do something back to them. And so it was a kind of turbulent environment that Islam came onto the scene with respect to. One of the things, of course, was that in many of these tribal units, the male who had multiple wives wasn't always even able to support them, except to keep them almost as though they were slave labor. And one of the things that Islam reforms is the idea about who should have multiple wives. And of course, the Quran stipulates that you have to have sufficient wealth to support the woman, right? Or the women, I should say, they have more than one wife. So the point is that what Islam does is it comes on the scene as a civilizing force for these people who are otherwise existing in a kind of tribal rivalry, which was not terribly productive to the development of any kind of high civilization. In the case of Muhammad, I should also mention that Muhammad himself came from a particular family, and this was the Quraysh family, and the word actually means sharks. And I find this amusing personally because it's very much like the movie West Side Story. I mean, it's amusing. If you have gangs fighting each other, involved in mutually internecine warfare, and they name themselves after animals, animal totems. And this is common also in antiquity. So he actually comes from a particular tribal unit that has a name for itself. And as I say, the emblematic, the totemic symbol is that of a shark. And they are individuals engaged in a hard-scrabble existence, fighting for their existence really as traders, bringing goods across the desert. Very few of these individuals are literate. This is an environment where literacy is not great, although a profound development of oral poetry grows up on the The other thing is that the nomadic culture, I think I jumped ahead. The nomadic culture, which is typical of Al Jazeera, is one that's linked also religiously to poetry in a curious way. And by that I mean that there are existing on the Arabian Peninsula two types of individuals who are considered to be keepers of wisdom and literacy at the time. And one group of them are what we would call shamans, or individuals who are ecstatic seers. And they very often fall into trance and pronounce utterances which are very often rhymed utterances. So on one hand, you have the rhymed utterances of ecstatics. These ecstatics very often wander the abandoned regions, right, the desert regions, live by themselves. They tend to be loners. And they tend also to be in commerce, in commune, they communicate with all kinds of supernatural beings. So, for example, jinns, right, or what we would call genies, are some of the creatures that they have commerce with. And then also, it's said about these ecstatics that the shaitans, right, the Satans, actually inspire them as well. So they're uncanny individuals, a little bit spooky, right? And they are some to bring us a little. The other individuals are the poets themselves. And in the case of the poets, these individuals are associated with the idea of knowledge itself. They are the seers in some sense of society as well. And so you have two groups of people who are viewed as you might say, the bringers of revelations at the time. And they are a group of people who intentionally, rationally create works of poetry, and then those who by ejaculation, by their ecstatic state, also give poetic utterances. So these look like the twin foundations of some of the literature which stand behind what is called the Quran. This is going to become important later on. If you were to ask, well, what's the worldview of these Arabian people at the time of Muhammad? The best way to represent it is by a series of concentric circles. We might imagine that even as they become Muslims, their Muslim faith becomes their chief identification. But this does not seem to be true, and it's even not true today. If you look at places like Iraq, tribal affiliation is sometimes more central than religious affiliation. So that what you have is you have the tribe as being the absolute center, right, of commitment and interaction among these people. And then you have Arab society in the broader sense, right, what surrounds, right, the tribal unit, and then Islam, and then finally the non-Islamic world. So these represent a series of shells. So it's not exactly national identity, but tribal identity or regional identity is much more important, for example, than some kind of universal Islamic identity. And that explains in part why there are these divisions, national and ethnic divisions between the various Muslim people there. So I say this because I just want to dispel a misapprehension, and it's largely a misapprehension I think that comes from the media to some extent, namely that Islam is some kind of monolithic religious tradition where there's perfect agreement. Now I will admit that Muslims, when they evangelize, sometimes talk this way, right? But the fact is that Muslims don't provide a monolithic front, as it were, for the religious tradition. But there are a number of variations in their own affiliations, their ethnic affiliations. And then, more particularly, there are lots of divisions in their religious beliefs. There are denominational differences, too, which we don't get a sense of, I think, unless we've read a little bit about Islam, or at least live there for a while. Okay, so let's come to the point about the Arabic language and the significance it has for Muhammad. Well, one of the chief significances of the Arabic language is simply that the Quran is written in it. And why is that important? Because the claim is made, and we'll see this later on, that you cannot take the Quran and translate it into any other language without emptying it of meaning. So that if you notice on any translation of the Quran you may have seen, it will often say an interpretation of the Quran, an interpretation, not a translation, because the general view within the Islamic tradition is the subtlety of the words, and the very fact that the words themselves were chosen by God, although the language pre-existed, of course, the inspiration. Even so, God's choosing the words in the order that he did, with the syntax that he did, with the poetic expressions that he did, means that this cannot be rendered without detriment into another language. So the best that anyone who doesn't read Arabic can get is an interpretation. And of course, this is the general recognition that most people who study scriptural languages have, namely that all translations are really an interpretation. So you always have to, in some sense, go back to the original language. But this becomes, how would we say, this becomes set in concrete within the Islamic tradition. There's no acceptance of the idea that a person could ever become a scholar of this book unless that individual studies the languages, studies the language of the book, which is Arabic. The other thing is that there's certain features of this language, even to this day, are kept alive. And one of them is, because it was an oral culture that gave rise to it, it's often the case that the whole Quran was memorized, right? In the various schools throughout the Middle East, right? It's often the case that what establishes whether you get the certificate, graduation from your Quran school, is whether you can memorize it and speak the Quran verse by verse from any point. So given a start, you would start and then you could finish it. And then, of course, later on, the expectation is that you'd actually be able to interpret what you memorize. But the actual memorization of the text becomes very, very important. And these schools are called madrasas. I want to say something about that memorization. It occurs within Judaism, but not so much within Christianity. I've only known one Christian who actually memorized the whole Bible, and it was quite phenomenal. He started in many points. Of course, he didn't understand the meaning of it very well, which is unfortunate, but that's another story. We have a great sense of the significance of much of what he memorized. He was a very brilliant guy, and he had memorized the whole Bible. And so it's not inconceivable to do this. I know we're all dependent on our electronic augmentations these days, but in a culture which is essentially orally based, where literacy is not great, it becomes a prized possession, prized part of one's personality to memorize this. And of course, nothing makes you close to a text like actually memorizing it. If you have that interpretive distance, it's really a great way to go. So one of the things about Arabic language is that it's tied to the Quran in an absolute way. And as I said, not because the language itself necessarily is special, but because this is the language that God used in order to reveal the Quran. And as to the origins of Arabic, well, this is an open question. Scholars know that it was a language spoken by the so-called classical Arabic at the time in which Muhammad emerged as a prophet. And they also know that it as a language, was early on put to extraordinary use by the people living on the peninsula. And so let me just back up for a second. You have to understand that these are people living at a time where the wealth was not great. Of course, there was no discovery of anything, any kind of mineral wealth that anyone wanted. And so they made their existence just barely by being herders or traders. And so that meant that their material culture was not highly developed. There were some cities on the Islamic Peninsula built, particularly in the southwest and to some extent the southeast. And these become the object of speculation on the part of the Arabians at the time of Muhammad. And in fact, they're being reviewed dimly, negatively, because they're associated with polytheism. So they're viewed as civilizations which declined because of their commitment to a polytheistic worldview. But at the time Muhammad lived, the material culture was very simple. It was essentially a nomadic and trading culture. And what this meant was there was no development of what we would call technology, no development of the arts or literature quite as we understand it. But there was the development of one particular form, and that was the poetic form. And so what would happen is very much as in the case of Greece and probably in the case of Israel, these tribes would get together periodically at various cultic sites. This is called an Amphictyon, and a bunch of tribes gather together at a cultic site. And once a year, at least, they would gather together and they would have the joining of the tribes. The tribes would come together without hostilities, and they would have a feast. And at the feast, they would not only use this as a time to trade stock, which is very important, but they would also engage in competitions, the equivalent of a poetry slam. I don't know whether any of you have ever been to a poetry slam in a bar elsewhere, where people get up and read their own deep poetry or hit poetry, and they try to outdo each other, and someone wins the prize, maybe for the evening. It depends on how it's set up. You get the club. This was for a period of time revived. Not really kind of poets that, but this was revived in the 90s. But as far as I think it's featured in a movie called My Wife is an Axe. That's probably not a mistake. But anyway, the point is that there would be competitions, poetic competitions. And it's here that most people would argue that the poetry which precedes the Quran gets developed in a dramatic way. So people would get together, they'd have these poetic competitions, and what they would attempt to do, part of the point of these poetic competitions, was to create exaggerated or romantic pictures of what was otherwise a dull existence. I mean, if you're herding sheep, there's not too much thrilling about that. So the challenge was to make it interesting. It's kind of like this class. The challenge of any kind of teaching is to try to make it interesting to some extent. Right? sometimes it's just beyond being interesting. You just have to learn it anyway. But the challenge, though, the challenge was to make this dull, hardscrabble life interesting to the other. And people would get points on the basis of how they created metaphors in order to convey, right, in some original way, what is otherwise a typical experience. And two things figured importantly in this kind of poetry. Women, as you might imagine, these are guys mostly named in poetry, and their animals, right? Women and their animals. It was very much like cowboys. Cowboys wrote cowboy songs. They wrote them about two things. Well, gunfights. Well, probably there were also poems about challenges and stuff, but they write songs about their horse, or their girlfriend, right? This is the way cowboys. And on the Arabian Peninsula is the case that this is the way these poetry competitions took place, on the basis of these primary themes, the things that the people do. So I have an example of this, and this actually comes from 7 odes. I think these are pre-Islamic odes that have been preserved. And I was wondering if I could get, by the way, the form is called the qasida, right, the qasida. And one of the things about this poetic form, of course, it's translated into English, so it doesn't quite capture it, but it sounds, the poems sound at their meter. So they sound like the rocking of a camel walking across the desert. So it's like da-da-da, da-da-da, the same kind of sound you might have for a horse, right, in some sort of a cowboy song. All right. I was wondering if someone would assist me by reading the passage. It's short enough for one person. Anyone want to read this? Pretty sexy passage. that stimulates the music. Someone be brave. It won't embarrass you. Please, just jump. Someone. Please.
Perfectly firm is the flesh or two thighs.
Okay, come on, read it with someone.
Perfectly firm is the flesh of the two thighs. They are the gates of a lofty, smooth, long castle.
I'm not going through the test.
And tightly knit are her spine bones, the ribs like bows. Her under the neck, stuck with the well-strung vertebrae, fenced about by the twin dens of a wild oak tree.
I'm not sure what a low tree is, but
Her cheek is smooth as Syrian parchment, her split lip tan hide of Yemen, its slit not bent crooked. Her eyes are a pair of mirrors, sheltering in the caves of her brow bones, the rock of a fool's hollow.
very beautiful poetry, right? Except for the split lip, which is a little bit strange. You might think this is a love poem, but it's actually a poem addressed to the camp. So this gives you some notion of, now, I'm not making fun of this because this is what cowboy songs are about too, and I like cowboy songs. But look at what it's doing. It's making interesting something, right, that would otherwise not be interesting. And notice the reaction, like the reaction in this group, which I don't know whether it's delight or at least amusement. That would be the same reaction that would be the intention of the writer, because what's the writer trying to do? Is he trying to say, I'm in love with my camel? No. What he's trying to do is make something which is otherwise mundane interesting. Give a description of day-to-day life, which draws you in. And of course, if you happen to be a male and hear these descriptions, you might start getting a little bit, interested in and then what happens? And suddenly you realize that he's talking about his camel. So there's that moment of realization. Now, it's not the case that the camel wasn't an important beast of burden. In fact, there are other odes which describe how important they are, how much above they are. But the same way, a cowboy's horse is treated, right? So people write and try to make significant what they know. And this kind of poetry was in efflorescence. It was growing and flowering at the time Muhammad came on the scene. So that when he receives his revelation, the revelation itself occurs, right, in a kind of poetic language. The Quran is expressed in a kind of similar poetic language, which this seems to be the basis of. This kind of poem, not the imagery, but the kind of poem seems to be the basis of. And we'll come back to that point a little bit later on. In terms of in terms of Arabic, as goes its linguistic features, in antiquity, Arabic is described by those people who have deep familiarity with it. That is to say, those who speak it, either the native speakers of it or, in many cases, Christian explorers, missionaries, or whatever. They describe it as being one of the most beautiful languages. And they describe it as being the most beautiful language because it's one of the languages where the expression of it and the content of it are virtually identical. And I say virtually identical, maybe that's an exaggeration, but they're very close to them. Put it another way. It's an onomatopoetic language. It's a language where the words sound like what they mean. So if someone's insulting someone else, even if you don't know Arabic, you can generally tell that they're insulting someone else. If someone's speaking love poetry to a beloved, right, you can tell that they're speaking love poetry. So the medium is the message. The medium of the language seems to transmit the inner emotional content. It also has some other features. It's a high rhetorical language. That is to say, it's a language which has lots of possibilities for communication, sometimes negative, sometimes positive. But one of the things that is generally agreed is that most of the people on the Arabian Peninsula who used it sometimes in a way that was somewhat frivolous. That is to say, in which the elaborate constructions and elaborate expressions occluded or hid the original meaning. But in terms of its objective features, one of the things about it is that it favors exaggeration, so that people who speak Arabic often engage in phrases, right, which we would find a little bit strange, or perhaps we'd be a little bit uncomfortable with. So let's take an example. A very simple day-to-day interaction, we might say, if we invited someone to a party, they weren't able to come, we might say something as simple as, we missed you. We missed you at the party. That might be the way we could express it. It would be much more common in Arabic to say, you made us desolate. The lack of your president made us desolate. Now, to say you were desolate because someone didn't come to a party is an exaggeration. You probably didn't even notice it till the party was over. But saying this, of course, it does something. It tells you how much you mean to the person, but it also puts them on a massive guilt trip, right? So it functions rhetorically in two different ways. We would say, good day, right? Or having a good day, how's your day going, something like that. Typically in Arabic, there's a formalized greeting, and it's like the following: may your day be prosperous. If I said good day or hello, you might just say hello back. If someone says, may your day be prosperous, the appropriate response is, may your day be prosperous and blessed. Now notice how that ups the ante. Because what have you tried to do now? Someone's wished you a prosperous day, and you respond by saying, not only do I wish you a prosperous day, but I wish your day to be blessed as well. The extent to which this kind of polite behavior is carried is really quite extraordinary. But one of the important things about this notion of exaggeration, is that when Westerners hear rhetoric, particularly spoken by people within the Eastern sphere, Arabic speakers, they frequently misunderstand how this rhetorical flourish works. Because very often, the rhetorical flourish is intentionally exaggerated. In other words, you might describe all the different ways in which you would like to have vengeance on someone else. But really, this is simply the rhetoric that's expected. It doesn't mean you really intend to do all that. Right? This is like trash talking in basketball. Like you might say all kinds of terrible things to the other person. But what are you trying to do? You're trying to unnerve them. Right? By certain conventions, you're trying to unnerve them. There's another feature of this, and the peculiarity of Arabic is that there is a convertibility between saying, I want to do something and I will do it. But if someone invites you to a party, you might respond, I'll be there. Knowing full well that you have no intention of going. You do this all the time. I had a friend who was notorious at this. He would accept all these invitations to give weddings any given weekend and pick the best one. And then everyone would be left thinking he was coming to their party and he wouldn't show up. This is considered really bad manners in most Arabic-speaking cultures. So instead of saying, I will be there, you would respond, and this is polite and honest, I want to be there. I want to. But that doesn't guarantee that you'll be coming. You notice this? It's my desire to be there, but other things may intervene. I may give a better invitation to another party, right? But I won't necessarily be there. Now, what's important about this is very often when people threaten one another, Islamic culture, they threaten each other by saying, I want to strangle you. Right? Like the husband or wife might say, I want to kill you. But they don't really mean that they intend to pick up a knife and stick it in the other person. What do they mean? Well, it's an exaggeration. And in the same way, sometimes when we hear the political rhetoric of some of these figures now in the geopolitical scene, we hear them saying that they intend to do A, B, C, D, E, F, people who are skilled in understanding how Arabic functions understand that they're not promising anything. They're just saying what? We're so terrifically angry with you that this is how we feel. We would like to strangle you. We would like to blow you up. We would like to do any number of things. But we don't intend to do it. We don't intend to. All right, let me stop there. We will pick up.